We need to back up, not just back up, but move rapidly in the opposite direction.
So it's not a transition if we are producing more oil and gas. And we're kind of screwed until we start listening to First Nations people and to the workers who have worked in the oil and gas sector.
Transition. That's the just piece, is making sure that everybody benefits, nobody is left behind.
Avoid the politics and get down to the nuts and bolts. And for many politicians, the bottom line is jobs.
There's a lot of resources and support, and there's kind of a wave that we can be part of.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Third Thursday, it's Climate Forum. When we learn together, we bring a bunch of experts from around Grey and Bruce and the traditional territory of the Saugeen Nation into one room so that we can talk about an issue that's relevant locally. And tonight we're going to be talking about just transition and how it applies to our communities. So we've got lots of people here tonight. You're welcome, Ostertag and myself. We co-host these sessions. And we're welcoming 4 panelists, and throughout the who will speak about how the just transition movement applies to their particular community and to the region as a whole. This was all came about when before the election, the federal government has decided to finally open some public outreach to get some feedback from the general public on just transition. So it sort of prompted us to see how this topic is affects us locally here. So yeah, to kick us off tonight, I was going to pass it over to Nick Clayton, and Nick is from the Blue Mountains area, and he is a former Green Party candidate. So thank you. Enough from me. Nick, let's hear about you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for hosting these events. It's really nice to be able to have this forum and have it be regional as well, because there's a lot going on disparately. It's a very big area. So it's nice to have these things to bring us all together on a common cause. So a just transition. As Lee mentioned, I ran in the federal election for the riding as a Green Party candidate in the last election, and a just transition is pretty much the centerpiece of the Green Party's I guess focus at this time is a just transition, because there has to be a transition, and it doesn't happen without the social equity piece, the social justice piece. So tagline is, there is no climate solutions without climate justice. I think I may have just butchered that actually, but it's something like that. And we're talking about a just transition. I think sure everybody knows here that there's an equity piece to that. So there's often the comparison made to World War II in terms of the mobilization that we need to make, mobilization of people, will, resources, financial, especially, to overcome the climate crisis. And you can't do that without making sure everybody benefits from the transition. That's the just piece, is making sure that everybody benefits, nobody is left behind. And really, we have the pandemic and the lockdowns to really show us what A, an emergency response looks and feels like, and B, it has laid bare all of the inequities that are basically already out there. So we knew they were there, and they were just exposed by the pandemic. So the people who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic were, you can see, women, people working minimum wage jobs. When I say women, women were the people who lost their jobs first, and disproportionately, people working minimum wage jobs were declared essential, but they aren't paid as essential. And we're seeing that play out now. And there's a labor shortage because people realize they're essential, and they're worth more than they've been, than I guess they've been treated so far. So that's financial, or poverty needs to be addressed as part of a just transition. A relationship with Indigenous peoples on this land is essential, not just for equity, but because of what Indigenous knowledge systems bring to the table. So I don't think there is any way forward for Canada without, I'm really reluctant to use this word, but integrating Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. For example, forest fires that were rampant this summer, world headlines of what was going on in Western Canada, heat dome, the town of Lytton, BC. Indigenous knowledge, and they're finally acknowledging this, the way that they manage forests would have actually been of benefit and far superior to the way that I guess governments have been, and forest management has been approached by Western governments. So if we incorporated that knowledge that is there and respected it as it should be, then I think we'd be a lot better off. And Indigenous knowledge systems really are the way forward. So I don't think I think land back, as far as a federal solution, they're talking about Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I think that's the buzz term, but really it's land back, giving land back to Indigenous people, putting under Indigenous stewardship. That's where it's best kept. They have a different relationship with the land than Western governments, and it's the relationship we need to have a sustainable society. So Indigenous protected and conserved areas, that's one solution. Right now we're seeing energy shocks and prices. So people who, I guess most of us rely still on gasoline vehicles, heating fuel for our homes, we're all seeing the sticker shock at the pumps. We're bracing for really high fuel prices this winter. So a just transition is a smooth transition. I don't think we're going to get past these energy shocks easily. It's part of the transition away from fuel, because we're managing supply and demand. Right now, the supply side is low, and there was not a lot of investment in oil over the pandemic because demand was so low. Now we're seeing the opposite spike of that. And honestly, people can say what they say about, when the wind blows and when the sun shines in terms of renewables, but really the shocks from supply and demand from the energy sector now as it is, I don't imagine it being worse than that, but that's what we're living right now. So a just transition has to be as smooth as possible. Ideally, we would have started this 30 years ago, and it would have been a nice, smooth emissions reduction curve. Now we're at a roller coaster peak where it has to really dive down, and I don't see that happening without some disruption in people's lives. But again, the pandemic has shown us what disruption in our lives looks and feels like. It exposes a lot of the inequities in society, and that's why we need to make sure that everybody's taken care of. Retraining and new technologies. So there's some really, really great ideas being thrown out here about microgrids, retrofits. Okay, so I think the low-hanging fruit as far as the federal solutions, because a lot of things don't fall under federal jurisdiction. They fall, the important stuff, energy, for example, is provincial. Homes and retrofits isn't really, it's basically the federal government's going to put the money and support where it needs to be to support the provinces and municipalities. So we need to be in alignment, and that's where the federal government comes in. And I think the current federal government has done a pretty good job of at least setting the tone. They tend to say one thing and do another, but at least they're setting the tone and saying, this is the new conditions we're living under. So let's mobilize and move together in the same direction. And that's exactly the kind of leadership we need at the federal level. So talking about retrofits, how do you convince somebody who lives in a house to give it a deep energy retrofit? One solution that's being used in Windsor, this is a municipal thing, is to incorporate, I don't exactly what the term is, but loans done through property taxes that could be ported from one owner to the next, just like your hot water rental heater would be ported from one owner of a house to the next. You can finance through your property taxes a deep energy retrofit. These could be funded by the federal government. It's a huge industry just waiting to happen. It's going to have a massive impact in Canada, because a full quarter of our emissions at least are to do with heating buildings and homes. So if we are able to reduce that, the need for that, or create greater efficiency in that regard, it's going to go a long way toward per capita emissions in Canada and our gross emissions coming way down. Microgrids are another exciting thing. Central net metering is, and again, this is a provincial matter, but local distribution companies. So having the way that our meters are set up, we can measure energy coming in and energy going out. So we can all be energy producers. The future is a decentralized electricity grid in Canada. So we're even looking at now cars becoming sources of battery storage. Cars are going two-way as well, just like our meters on our houses. The new Ford F-150, for example, is not just a battery storage or car device. It can actually be a source of electricity, and it has enough electricity to power your house for 3 days or something like that, your entire house. So people are going to have battery storage backup in their driveways now, and that's going to change the whole way that we look at energy in Canada and the world. So it's decentralized now to the point where, yeah, everybody has a backup battery in their driveway, and they can actually be plugged into the grid through our meters. And when there's an energy shortage, batteries can become a source of energy. And I know this is a really contentious issue in our area because of the Meaford water battery, the water storage generation plant that's being proposed and looked at. When you look at that, what that represents to people, it's a very, very contentious thing. But to give it some perspective, to replace that Meaford plant with batteries, you would need something over almost 350,000 Tesla Powerwall 2 systems. The cost of $10 to $12 billion. Each one is $17,000 to set up in your house. So to create the kind of like decentralized battery storage through homes like that would cost billions and billions of dollars to replace that one thing in Meaford. So if we're looking at replacing battery storage in vehicles, and on all vehicles now, EVs will be made this way, and federal mandates for EV sales are contributing to this, then it will take a while to scale up to the point where we can have this type of battery storage that would offset the need for, and this is a big issue in Ontario, natural gas. That's the Ford government's plan for replacing aging nuclear plants, is natural gas fired electricity generation. Some 500% increase in emissions in Ontario. We have one of the cleanest grids in Ontario in North America right now, and that's in jeopardy. And that's even without taking into account the Ford government's sprawl agenda, which is to expand into pristine greenbelt and farmland right now, instead of investing in more dense 15-minute cities, which is what we need.
You've got a couple of minutes left. Maybe you could just point us as far as what it means for the workforce in and around Blue Mountains, Collingwood, and Owen Sound.
Yeah, I think one of the we have agriculture and tourism, big industries. I don't know. The industry here it's impossible to not imagine it being impacted by climate change and changes in the environment. Agriculture, huge thing right now. It's a net source of emissions. It's degrading soil. It's not sustainable. We've moved past. I don't even like to use the word sustainable anymore. We need regenerative, because we've moved past the point where we are sustainable. We've been digging a hole so deep for so long that we actually need to start fixing it. So when we talk about carbon storage, that's what we're talking about. It's like we've gone so far that we can't just stop emissions. Even if we stopped emissions now, we'd still be too far. So we need to actually start sequestering carbon in a major way. Agriculture can be part of that. Right now, it's a net source of emissions due to nitrogen fertilizers mainly. But it can become a net carbon sink through and make soil more healthy, but using different agricultural practices. So I know it's a challenge because grain farmers in the area especially depend on fossil fuels for drying grain under certain conditions. And that's a real sticking point. So there's no technological solution around that right now. So that's a major challenge. But I don't think it's as much of a challenge as just dealing with entrenched attitudes about, we live in a very, I'm going to get a little political here, a very conservative riding. And people really are invested in the way things are. And there's been, you can see, again, to use the pandemic as an example, so much pushback against, broad government interventions, and the solutions to the climate crisis don't happen without broad government interventions. So I'm really concerned about entrenched attitudes about, the way that we do things now, and just trying to find a way forward that actually everybody can embrace. So a just transition, just to sum up, means that everybody has to know that they're going to benefit from the changes that are coming. And unless we get an all hands on deck, full mobilization of every resource that we have, we're not going to get there because the timing matters.
So one question to you, Nick, is that what is your stand on the pumped storage project in Meaford? And actually, I added a question to that. Like the Clean Air Alliance suggests that we have contracts with Quebec eventually, and rather than having the storage, using power from there. They have lots of hydropower.
Hydro from Quebec is my preferred choice for everything, and the Green Party advocates for a national energy strategy and a national energy corridor that links the provinces for sharing of energy resources. I think that everything, there's a lot of nuance to everything, and I'm really reluctant to even touch the TC Energy that proposed, because it's a minefield. But if you look at the technology objectively, it's one of those things that it's, I think, a solid, reliable, and it's a form of storage that actually has a lot of merit, but it's not something that you want anywhere near you. And I think we could see the same thing with, wind turbines earlier on. Sure, they're great. There's some downsides to them, but nobody wants them around, right? So as far as TC Energy goes, I was highly skeptical of the technology when it first came out. I said, why are we spending our electricity to pump something up just to get it back later? Well, it's a battery. It's a giant battery, and it's 8,000 megawatt hours storage. Puts out 1,000 megawatts an hour in terms of generation when it's needed. I'm open to an environmental proposal, but it has to be, in my view, it has to be in agreement with local First Nations. I would not proceed with a straight up environmental assessment. It has to be with the more or less the approval of local First Nations.
I'm wondering about people who can't afford to purchase a home, especially given soaring housing prices these days. How do we make sure not to leave them behind? And related, what is the role of affordable housing for a just transition?
That's such a great question, and they're so related. They're incredibly related. Right now, the county's undergoing a comprehensive review, and they're running up against the province's growth plan. So the province is saying, we need this many more new homes. The population is going to increase by 50% here in the next 10 years. You need to start sprawling outwards. So they're all for boundary expansion and creating R1, R2 zoning homes. So these are single family homes and townhomes that eat up all of this space. And I drive by every day a new development in Collingwood that just on the edge of Collingwood that used to be a cornfield, used to be making food. Now it's a subdivision. It's been paved over completely. So this type of development is not sustainable ecologically, and it's not sustainable financially, and it's inefficient. So it's inefficient in absolutely every way. It's going to bankrupt municipalities if we keep spreading out.
Based on the consumption at the current level. But the question is if that's sustainable, the level of consumption that we are used to these days.
So another tricky question, because when you talk about consumption, we're talking about possibly anti-consumerism, anti-capitalism, and capitalism. Just transition means we need to address social inequality and the climate crisis at the same time. So that's a lot, but they're all related. So, and you're talking about affordable housing too. That's related to the climate crisis. These are all climate solutions. Capitalism, consumption, absolutely part of the crisis as well. Can we solve capitalism and the climate crisis in the next 10 years? Probably not. So I'm thinking, and this is why I'm ran for the Green Party, because they are, they have like an eco-capitalism component to them. We need to fix things within the system. I don't know if we can change the system while we fix it. So there's a lot of, you look at EVs, buying EVs. This is the EV revolution is coming. Every manufacturer's on board. It's not going to solve the climate crisis. Not everybody can afford, there's going to be gas cars on the road for years. And even if we replaced every single car right now with an EV, we still have a climate crisis. So, I don't see.
It's almost an impossible question to answer. And maybe at the end, if we have some time, we can, as a panel, kind of dive brief into this again, because this is kind of at the basis of all these issues that we talk about. But thanks very much, Nick. It was
Okay.
really great. And well, we'll hear you again. And so we go to the next speaker, Lee.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Nick. And yeah, tonight is called Just Transition or the Status Quo. So of course, the status quo, it could leave Gray and Bruce workforce and workers and jobs all behind, right? So we're thinking in that context here in Gray and Bruce in the traditional Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory. And thank you, Nick. We'll go on to David Mclaren, who's you might all know as a former candidate for the NDP in the Grey Bruce Owen Sound riding, different riding than Nick's.
All right. Well, Nick said a lot of good things, most of which I agree with. A couple of things I don't. And maybe we could talk about the TC Energy thing a little bit later. As you just pointed out, I ran for the NDP in 2015, but I came up into the area in 1990 when the bands were looking for someone to help them with their land claims and their fishing rights issues. So I've been here ever since, but there was a time when I was actually recruited by the Canadian Environmental Law Association to work on communications for them. So I have a little bit of background in environmental law as well, although I'm not a lawyer. So and I think that we should really start with a reality check. And we have to admit in that reality check that Canada is one of the world's biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. And it's the biggest emitter on a per capita basis. So we have a lot of work to do. Emissions are actually going up despite what the climate change page on the website says. The crisis has become too big, I think, for individuals and municipalities. It now requires serious government action at a higher level. Although municipalities and individuals can certainly do their part. But the federal government is still subsidizing big oil and gas to the tune of about $18 billion in 2020. But the Liberals' climate action plan is only $15 billion over 10 years. So I think they've got a lot of work to do. The subsidies, if you include the subsidies of $18 billion, if you include the offloading that the oil and gas industry does onto people's health and onto the environment, it goes up to about $64 billion. And that's a figure that comes out of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. But if you include on that cleaning up orphan wells in the West that are leaking methane, the price or the subsidized price to big oil and gas goes up to about $300 billion. So the government says it'll reduce emissions from oil and gas, and that's fine, but the International Energy Agency now says that we need to stop production of oil and gas. We have much more carbon in the works, more oil and gas production than we can possibly handle if we want to keep the global warming down to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So the Liberals are promising a 40 to 45% cut in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge for them to meet. In the meantime, more and more Canadians are seeing this and becoming frustrated with the government. Promises that they will do things and then not do them. And they're particularly frustrated, 60% of us are frustrated with the government for not implementing the 2015 promise to stop taxpayer subsidies to the fuel industry and a 2019 promise to introduce a just transition legislation. So they are working now, I understand, on a just transition act, but we haven't seen very much of it. And we know that they have not been talking to workers. They have not been talking to labor. Let me just skip down a little bit more. I think that in the broad context of things, we have to realize that there's about 160,000 jobs that are directly working with big oil and gas, with the fossil fuel industry. That doesn't sound like very much, but there's about 800, almost 900,000 Canadian jobs are at stake when we transition into clean energy world. Those are folks who work in the auto industry, work in garages. There's a lot more people who are involved with the oil and gas industry than just the ones who are directly employed. And that means that we're going to have to, for a just transition, we're going to have to start talking to workers a little bit more than we are. Now, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices says that the transition is coming from factors outside of Canada's control. So, you know, although we pretend that we can control what's going on in Canada, in fact, the global shift is already underway. In May, the International Energy Agency published a net zero report that concluded there was no room for any new fossil fuel development to hold global warming to a target of 1.5 degrees centigrade. The Center for Future Work says that although there's 160,000 people who are directly employed by the industry, there's a lot more who are actually rely on the oil and gas industry. So I'm going to go very quickly through these notes because I'm actually a lot more interested in what people are asking than I am in hearing myself talk. But there's very little that municipalities can do in the light of the crisis. But, you know, we should be doing something. And I don't think Owen Sound, for example, which is the largest community in the area, is much of a model. They went from promising to hire someone to look at what the city could do locally regarding climate change. Then they withdrew that promise, and now they're not talking about climate action at all in the city. We have to look at everything from a climate crisis perspective, I think. And along with that, of course, a just transition from fossil fuels to green. Owen Sound uses concrete, but you know, you can mix powdered recycled glass in with the production of cement to make concrete last a lot longer. Owen Sound can insist that new builds use innovative construction materials and methods, even something as simple as passive solar heating. Cities have a lot more authority than they think they do. Under Section 3 of the Municipal Act, they have the ability to protect health and the environment of their citizens. Owen Sound can retrofit its own buildings, maybe even go to net metering. But the real changes will come when government begins to redirect our massive subsidies to big oil and gas, to green energy, research and development, and production of green energy, including storage. I think that green storage is really not that far in the future. The batteries are getting better and better. And I'm not sure that we're going to need things like the TC Energy project that's in Meaford. But a just transition for workers really requires that we sit down and talk to the unions and to the workers. We need to make sure that they transition into a living wage economy and that their retirements are planned for. It turns out that the Indigenous Environmental Network in the States teamed up with Oil Change International to quantify the impact of Indigenous resistance to fossil fuel projects in the US and Canada. And they calculate that Indigenous resistance alone over the past decade has stopped climate pollution equivalent to 400 new coal-fired power plants. First Nations have retained the highest levels of biodiversity on any settled area in Canada. There's more biodiversity at Cape Croker than there is in most of Grey Bruce Owen Sound. The vehicle for engaging First Nations is UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's now adopted by Canada, and if Canada sees fit to ensure that when they sit down to consult with First Nations, that they allow prior and informed consent, that's required if First Nations are going to be equal to the government in discussing and in deciding on environmental assessments of projects that might do harm to their rights and claims, which is one of the complaints I have about TC Energy project. And I think it's more and more credible that folks that we have managed to marginalize for 300 years have a certain relationship with the earth that we need to know about, and their way of knowing about nature and the world and the earth and the water is completely different from ours, regardless of our environmental credentials. So it's not a transition if we are producing more oil and gas. And we're kind of screwed until we start listening to First Nations people and to the workers who have worked in the oil and gas sector. We could stop with targets and we should probably stop with setting targets and get to work. Or as John Butler wrote to me, he's the editor of the Village Green, we could simply pray to St. Jude, the patron saint of hopeless causes. But I don't think it is a hopeless cause. And there's some optimism that I'm glad that Nick was able to convey. But we do need to get to work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was a rather lots of encompassing knowledge that you shared with us. And there is one question here. I'm just asking one question that came from Joyce Hall. David, according to the FCM, over 50% of emissions are under the direct influence or control of local governments. Do you agree with that?
No, the bad boy, unfortunately, in Canada is still the oil and gas industry. And I don't think the local governments have any control over that. Certainly, buildings and the rest of the infrastructure that we have contribute to global warming, but the single major source, I think, is localized in the West, in the oil and in the fossil fuels industry.
Thanks very much, Dave. And let's move on.
David made a great point. It is all about you, the viewers here, and getting to know what's on your mind. So we're halfway through these 4 intros. These intros are really great for getting to know what's on the mind of the people in talking about just transition. So it's really great to check in and get 10 minutes from each person. It's also great to check in with their area. And David, as most of you know, lives just north of Wyerton in Nishnawbe. Our next panelist is Joyce Hall, and I mentioned all this because Joyce's context is in Grey Highlands, which is, of course, battling with development here, there, and everywhere. So Joyce, take us away. What's on your mind?
Thank you. It's a joy to speak on this because actually I began my career in activism as in affordable housing, actually as a tenant activist. So here I am back at housing, and housing I think is central to the just transition. So it's to me, it's not coincidental that we have 2 crises on our hands at the same time. Both were hot issues during the federal election: climate change and affordable housing. The intersection between them is this: the way we create housing, especially in small communities, but also in urban centers, is destructive to the climate, and it's destructive to people. At one of our GB CAN meetings, someone from West Grey had noted in a subdivision going up in Durham and mentioned, it looks as if nothing's changed. It's the same old development: wide paved streets, large houses, driveways for cars, curbs, lawns, etc. What she was observing was the continuation of the 1950s suburban model of creating shelter: cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all single-family houses for nuclear families with 1 or 2 cars, zoned as single-family dwelling. A model which perpetuates unaffordable, unwalkable community and wastes space and contributes to climate change. Over time, developers through the 50s, 60s, 70s persuaded councils to increase minimum house size, to increase profits at great expense to the taxpayer who foots the bill for providing infrastructure for low density sprawl. As we face a climate crisis, this model radically fails to serve our purposes. So we need to back up, not just back up, but move rapidly in the opposite direction, eliminating sprawl and intensifying settlement. Needless to say, the saved acreage can perform valuable ecological services through allotment gardens, native plantings, partially wilded park spaces. Eco communities which are springing up all over the place design parking clusters instead of 1 driveway per house. That's just one idea, which reduces the squandering of land by paving it over, which is the worst thing that you can do in terms of climate change for your land. I attended a Collingwood World Summit, which was fantastic. There were mayors from all around the world, and there were so many ideas that were coming out during that conference. And I just took a kind of scattergun grab bag that I'd like to share with you. These are like notes that I took during the 2 days. Mayors were there from Scotland, Ireland, Austria, Kenya, the Maldives, Togo. They were from all over. And affordable housing, if you can believe it, was an issue everywhere. And here, okay, so here's some ideas that I heard at that conference. Affordable housing, even more than a human right, is an economic imperative. Businesses cannot find workers without it. And workers who are spending over half of their income on housing have no dollars to spend to support the local economy. And this comment was made by Marg Sheben-Edey, who's the vice chair of Collingwood's Affordable Housing Task Force. Here's another very interesting idea that I heard. Consider a ban on single family zoning, a move which has been enacted by California and Oregon. Yellowknife Mayor at the conference, her name is Rebecca Alty, echoed the need for modernized zoning, allowing more building up. This is in Yellowknife. And Squamish Mayor Karen Elliott reported that a progressive zoning overhaul was accomplished smoothly in her community with a high level of buy-in by members of the community. Both of those mayors from Squamish and Yellowknife advocated the need for inclusionary zoning that requires developers to include affordable housing as a percentage of any project. Yellowknife zoning changes also allowed for urban agriculture, allowing people to grow food close to home. Another from my grab bag of notes, in Vienna, 2/3 of the population live in publicly owned housing. In other words, they're tenants. They're tenants in publicly owned housing. Anne-Marie Shaw, who is the director of housing for Grey County, spoke at the conference in favor of land banks to remove land out of speculative markets. If we don't hang on to the public land we have, she said, it won't be there in 10 years. One speaker pointed out that housing has created an accelerating wealth gap between owners and renters. And this wealth gap induces social alienation, which creates a whole host of problems, separate and attached. One mayor pointed out that her community was reluctant to change zoning for fear of scaring away developers. This was kind of a jaw-dropping to me, an example of the tail wagging the dog. In fact, with migration from the south raising the pressure to create housing, Grey County is in a good position to determine the rules of engagement for developers. The conversation about this topic is timely because the county is currently inviting responses to its climate change action plan, or its CCAP. And I'll give details about that in the chat later. The consultations are on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday next week. I've been looking at that CCAP pretty carefully with a group from Grey Boost Climate Action Network. And the section on land use planning has some excellent basic principles, some of which refer to the ideas that I was just mentioning. Strategy number 18 on page 58 of the CCAP is called Compact Mixed Use Development in Designated Settlement Areas. And it states, prioritize high density mixed use development throughout Grey County, especially for brownfield redevelopment projects. Consideration will be given to Grey's official plan update to zoning that supports sustainable growth principles. So zoning is on their radar in the climate action plan. As part of the compact mixed use development strategy, the following components I'm reading from the plan will also be included. Support for member municipalities to undertake compact mixed use development and intensification in designated settlement areas. I think in my area in terms of Markdale and Flesherton. Provision of incentives for development on brownfield sites, So Markdale is actually full of all these kind of funny little paved areas where there's like nothing. It's just doing absolutely nothing. And the plan mentions supporting access to grants for site studies and feasibility assessment, reduction in development charges, expedited permitting, servicing allocation, and developer awards and recognition. So they are looking at densification and mixed use, and that's the important thing, so that you can get away from these large, sprawling areas of housing with nothing else there, no services, definitely a lack of sequestration of natural landscapes, etc. GBCAN, Great West Climate Action Network, is preparing its response to the CCAP. And about this section, we've said this: small urban communities, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by intensifying settlement areas and reducing the need for driving. Use a smart city model mixing commercial and residential to increase walkability. Encourage the reduction or removal of minimum house size requirements across the county, as Grey Highlands has done, to allow intensification. I thought that was a great move on the part of Grey Highlands. They got rid of the minimum house size. Our response, GBCAN's response to the CCAP, also calls for full consultation on the dispensation of publicly owned lands, as these parcels are opportunities for community control of greenhouse gas emissions, and once sold are irretrievable. Another idea that has been embraced by little eco-village communities that are popping up include future users in developing the ideas for the communities, as has been pioneered. I'm thinking of Eco-Village in Ithaca and Glassworks in Owen Sound, where the future users are actually part of planning the housing, and you can have mixed tiny houses, multiple dwellings, buildings, single family townhouses, a mix with many shared spaces, parking on the outside, a ring around the outside. So in fact, is it a more correct articulation of the affordable housing crisis to call it a crisis in affordable, sustainable communities, including housing? So just rethink the whole way we do housing. Regarding the CCAP public consultation, it's happening now. A website is set up, and I'll put the website information in the chat. 3 dates have been set: October 26th, 27th, 28th. You can find the whole draft CCAP plan there, as well as Linda Swanston's email address, and she is the one who is in charge of these consultations. If you want to register and speak on this topic in particular, it's under land use on page 58 of the plan, strategy 18. You can also have a look at strategy 17, reforestation. That came to me as the questioner asked, as David was speaking about plans to use sequestration as Grey County's major tool in reducing climate our GHG emissions. It's clear that small Ontario communities such as ours have a world of options to look at, as I saw at that World Summit. As we negotiate the growth spurt caused by COVID with all these city dwellers moving up here, let's encourage the county and municipalities to implement some of those principles that they've articulated in the Climate Action Plan, and look for models in other municipalities around Canada, like we know Yellowknife and Squamish, and the world, for innovation to create sustainable communities. So I will put that that address in the chat, and if you want to speak during the consultation process on Grey County's Climate Action Plan, it's just in draft form, so they are supposedly, sincerely looking for input. You can register and speak. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Joyce. there are all kinds of questions coming in, and I just have to find. Yeah, there's one by Nick. Can you describe what intensification might look like in a local town, like Collingwood on Roy Owen Sound, or R1 zoned areas in general? And I think I combined this with another question, which was how do we leverage that municipalities change their bylaws, building bylaws?
Can you describe what the intensification might look like? Okay, interestingly, I watched a documentary on TVO about housing around the world, and in Tokyo, there's no zoning. Like if you can find like 12 square feet space, you can build a house. I think of they talk about brownfield development in the climate action plan, and I think just looking for ways to really just infill. Use dead spaces, especially dead spaces where there's nothing but, crabgrass and chipped pavement. And there's lots of that in Markdale. I don't know Collingwood very well. And just think, okay, how can we turn this into something? Housing, a community garden, whatever. So I think what it looks like really depends on what you've got there. And you really just walk around your community and think, where could housing go here? How could we intensify here? Maybe we could just, like they used to talk about, during the oil crisis when they were talking about, the end of fossil fuels because we were going to run out of them. Building on top of malls, just anywhere, I always love the old European city model where you have, 5 stories with, residential in the top floors and commercial on the bottom, services on the bottom. So yeah, you have to just kind of solve it in terms of your own community. What was the other question, Joaquin?
Oh, how to leverage
How to
municipalities.
leverage the municipalities to make those changes?
I think just for one thing, don't let them get away with giving away the land that is already in public hands. That public lands, that should not be going to sprawl. Some of the mayors at the World Summit said they felt very unfortunately they had committed 5 years back to some sprawling developments. And they sincerely regret it now. So I would start by making sure that your public land is thought about very, very carefully, and raise the issues of creative zoning. It's being done across Canada and around the world, through your climate action group or whatever. So yeah, that's my suggestion.
Okay, thanks so much, Joyce. We have to move on. So Lee, can you introduce the next speaker?
Yes, moving up the highway and in a carpool or in the Grey Transit route from Grey Highlands up to Owen Sound is Barry Randall, and Barry has a long list of accomplishments. I know him through Grey Bruce Sustainability Network, and I'll let him speak to what he knows about green jobs in this region in particular. Barry, go for it.
Hey, thanks, Lee. And thanks to Nick and Joyce and David for providing a really strong, a really strong backdrop for the idea of green jobs, because there's so much in terms of politics and science and technology that is involved with this discussion. It can easily go very broad. So what I'm wanting to do basically is to focus in on what are the economic opportunities in our local area that relate to, and I'll use the word green job, but I'll explain a little bit more why I'm not as I'm using terms more like sustainability and resilient and those sorts of things these days. In part, as Lee mentioned, I've worked with the Grey Bruce Sustainability Network for a number of years. 10 years ago, we started that group. And prior to that, we had an informal group called the Grey Bruce Environment Network. And the feeling was partly in line with the United Nations perspective on and use of the term sustainability, acknowledging that in order to have a healthier world, it's not just about improving the environment, because if your social situation or your economic situation is not good, then it's difficult to think that you're going to spend a lot of time caring about the quality of your water, because you have really no power in those areas. And that's kind of what I've sensed from the speakers to this point, really is not a lot of confidence in the local politicians, the federal politicians, the provincial politicians, not mentioning any names, of course, to lead the way on this. And I think one thing that really struck me the other day when I was having a little bit of a email conversation with my son, 30-something, and I told him that I was, and this was earlier today, I gave a presentation through the Community Foundation about carbon footprints and that sort of thing. And the focus was pretty strictly on green jobs and carbon footprints. And he sent me a quote from a magazine, an online piece that he, it's called mic.com. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's quite an interesting online magazine. And the quote was, "By promoting the carbon footprint as the single most important thing for concerned citizens to focus on, the fossil fuel industry ensured that we wouldn't put our energy toward what truly matters: collective action and activism." So that for me reminded me very much of the work that I used to do before I moved up here. And what I'm going to do is just go through some of the jobs that I've had up in this neck of the woods and a little bit before that, all of which my background's in environmental studies from the University of Waterloo. So that's the kind of work that I did. But in Guelph, I worked for a number of years with the Ontario Public Interest Research Group, group founded by Ralph Nader internationally. And a lot of what we did was march down the street with signs talking about a range of issues, but it was the influence that our community-based group had on the local council that ultimately made that city one of the leaders in, among other things, energy efficiency and a response to climate change. Now, obviously, things do come up and down with respect to politics, but to this day, they're one of the leaders in terms of things like green infrastructure and that sort of thing. So after I love Bruce County, I love Bruce Trail, and I used to go to the beach in Port Elgin from high school and that sort of thing. So when a job came up with the County of Bruce to help with their waste management master plan, I applied for it, and my wife and my two kids, we moved to Bruce County over 25 years ago, and we moved to Walkerton. Of course, we didn't know where Walkerton was because it's not on the way. I won't say it's not on the way to anywhere. It's not on the way to Port Elgin, but it's a beautiful little community in a valley. And so I spent 5 years working for the County of Bruce there, helping them prepare their waste management master plan. A good deal of it was focused on recycling and waste reduction and those sorts of things, but they were also, at that time, there were 33 municipalities in Bruce County, and every municipality had a landfill site, and some of them were filling up. So they needed a plan. And after 5 years, what I realized was that there wasn't a lot of support for, first of all, for amalgamating energies and amalgamating services, but also for the idea of waste reduction and recycling. There wasn't a strong push for it. But and ultimately, when after the the plan was finished, a year later, all the municipalities amalgamated, which opened up the rural landfill sites that were in townships, which couldn't be used before, opened those up to the larger municipalities like Kincardine and Port Elgin. So it put off the need to do anything in terms of waste reduction and recycling for about 20, 25 years. Now, municipalities are spending millions and millions of dollars to open up small bits of new landfill space in their poorly located landfills. So that was my experience with Bruce County. And so politics are important, but I think also with my social, I will say social enterprise experience with the OPERG group, it's so important to have community-led activism. So the other thing that I did when I was asked to present tonight, I wasn't exactly sure what the just transition movement was, whether it was a movement or whether it was just a word that somebody made up. So I looked it up, of course, and what is clear is that the government of Canada has adopted this this idea as a leading part of their portfolio. And basically what they're saying is that what they want to do is preparing the workforce to fully participate in the low carbon economy while minimizing the impacts of our labor market transitions, identifying and supporting inclusive economic opportunities to support workers in their communities, including workers and their communities in discussions that affect their livelihood. So it sounds like a great plan, especially engaging communities in discussions that will affect their livelihood. And some of the things, the regenerative agriculture piece that Nicholas mentioned, and all these activities that are going on in a small scale way in Grey and Bruce and Simcoe and Huron counties are the things that we need to focus on. So I'll just go through a couple of other things here that that my experience for our area has raised for me. And I worked for 2 or 3 years with a group out of Huron County. It was a regional economic development group called the Midwestern Ontario Regional Green Job Strategy. This was more than 10 years ago. And that somewhat leading edge group basically went all over the 4 counties, working with the 4 county labor market planning board, and identified a whole range of background government documents, policy documents, research documents, and for 3 years collected that information, promoted green jobs. The project was funded by the by the federal government. Funding ran out, everybody split from the project, and I was fortunate enough to, for $100, buy all the resources that are now here in the Harmony Center as part of our resource team. So that was just an example of, again, a funded project that didn't have the legs in terms of a social enterprise to keep going if the funding ran out. So that's just, in my mind, a reason to put legs on some of these projects. So if there's no more funding, they won't stop. Town of Blue Mountains, I worked there for a year as a contractor, helping them with their integrated community sustainability plan, basically a climate action plan to reduce emissions and to adapt their community. The project lasted for a year. It's through the federal Partners for Climate Protection program, which is the same one that Grey County is using, and collected data on all the emissions, the corporate and community emissions, for 1 year. And then I was done my contract, and the idea was that it was be taken over by the municipality to finish, set targets, and begin the reduction plan. Nothing happened. 10 years later, I worked with them just recently on the renewal of their community sustainability plan. So things go round and round, and now there's another group in Blue Mountains that is very sincerely and aggressively following a sustainability path. So, green jobs in our area, what are they? I'll use the word sustainable, resilient jobs. Groups like United Way is doing some fabulous work. They funded one of our community garden projects, a food security project. the new hydrogen optimization plant, leading edge. Even O'Share, the local soup kitchen, eco roster tiles out of Listowel, permeable paving tiles, styrofoam, a touring styrofoam densifier company that's for areas that aren't recycling styrofoam are driving around and helping communities densify the material so that it's then marketable. Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation doing incredible work to create more resilient shorelines in our area. The conservation authorities, energy auditors. We need more residential and commercial energy auditors in order to help businesses reduce their carbon footprint, and it needs to be economically viable for them to do that. What does that mean? Does that mean carbon fees? What does that mean? That's a whole other discussion. And I think finally, what I'll give a plug for is the group that I'm currently working with, the Grey Bruce Sustainability Network, which is set up as a social enterprise. I mean, it does earn income, not a charity. It does earn income. It's a not-for-profit organization, but it also solicits funding from granting agencies and private sector contributions. And I'm currently involved, in a couple of projects. One is a career-based program helping high school students understand what the opportunities are in green jobs. And the other is called Lake Huron Forever, which is a binational partnership with Michigan and our community foundations, which is designed to source out funding in order to finance green infrastructure projects, green roofs, permeable pavements, rain gardens, all kinds of things that reduce the impact of extreme weather events, which apparently are going to be happening soon and continue to happen. So I think with that, I'll just echo the idea of the Indigenous resistance and the importance of hearing from the First Nations groups and respecting and experiencing what the land has to offer to us is so important that I'll just reinforce what a number of people have suggested to this point. So thanks again, you guys, for organizing this and continuing to do these events. And I very much look forward to my Zoom going off and being able to meet in person with people. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Barry. It's interesting, the scope of presentations here. However, there's not a specific question to you as far as I can see. There's a question from Jenny, which is, I think, a great question to the whole panel. Are we prepared to actively petition our MP to take the Just Transition Act forward as a priority in the next 100 days? There's currently an organized approach and resources to support this across Canada that is being quite successful. Can we, Grey Bruce Climate Forum, this one here, coordinate this petition with support from local influencers and meet with local MP to take it forward in the House? Any thoughts on that idea of a petition?
The need for activism and in whatever form, I think, is really important. But what Jenny's suggesting here, and the Grey Bruce Climate Forum, which obviously has developed a good audience, and Joachim and Lee have done a great job organizing. And I think it's a great opportunity to utilize the energy that's around this table to do exactly not only what Jenny's talking about, which is a great idea, but there's also a lot of opportunity with our local councils to have a well-organized, well-strategized plan of, I won't say plan of attack, but plan of conversation, plan of delivering some of these messages in slightly different forms, obviously, but to our local councils as well. So I totally support Jenny's idea and would gladly would help to put something like that together.
The more people who are poking our political representatives at this point, the better. We know that the Liberals are talking and have been talking with the oil industry a lot more than they've been talking with workers. So it would sure be nice if Alex Ruff was able to take a message from Grey Bruce Owen Sound that the government really should be getting on its getting on the case in this at this particular time.
It's not just workers, and from your talk, Dave, it's also including Indigenous First Nations communities around here.
Yeah, the speaking as someone who's just participated in the last election, I paid close attention to the polls. Don't look at the polling because it's embarrassing for me. But if you look at the majority of the voters in the riding, they're progressive, and but it's a safe seat. It's a safe conservative seat in all the ridings in this area. We're very blue. But they need to not take that for granted. So I'm always a big advocate for take your concerns directly to your MPs. I tried to do that through a local environmental debate. The only person I wanted to meet was the incumbent, and he didn't show up because he has nothing to gain from showing up for an environmental debate. So I really, really strongly advocate for people to take your concerns and with as personal story as possible to them. I mean, we can come up with a petition that's has all of the jargon, but really I think they listen mostly to personal stories, individual stories. So I'm happy to do a petition, but they ignore those too easily. And I think when you come to your MP with a personal story, like I was at Protect Our Winters last night, and a presenter was moved to tears when he was talking about how he's witnessed the climate change affect the length of the cross-country skiing season. There's no blowing snow. They can't blow snow on a cross-country ski trail. So he's witnessed based on, they usually do a Christmas Day ski. Well, that didn't happen the last 2 years. So that's a very personal story, and he's witnessing this happen in real time in his life. And that's the kind of story you take your MP, and they sit up and they kind of have to listen.
Yeah, I was just looking up the Just Transition Act, and I see that it looks like it's a Liberal initiative. It's something's dated July on my phone here, dated July 20th, 2021, and it's coming out of the Minister of Natural Resources, and there is a contact person, a director of communications person, who we could contact regarding a just transition engagement, as they're calling it. So the thing is, because of party politics, it's just so difficult in Canada. If we're not in a Liberal riding, so anything that the Liberal government is promoting, they're bound to say, we don't believe in a just transition. That's a Liberal idea. So I don't know. Maybe Nick has the right idea. Go with your own story and let them come up with their own jargon. I don't know. I'd certainly be willing to talk about it.
I think with any politician, especially if it's an issue that, as you say, liberal versus conservatives, I think the strategy really has to be avoid the politics and get down to the nuts and bolts. And for many politicians, local and provincial and federal, the bottom line is jobs these days. The bottom line is, how do we sell ideas? And I think if you can make a case, not necessarily even using the word green jobs, but just make a case for the need to transition our economy into new kinds of occupations and some old occupations that can be reinvented. I think if that's the topic of discussion for Alex Ruff, which can be, he's not here, right? Can be hidden under that, the climate or the just transition idea, because it all makes total sense. We're in a transition, whether it's post-COVID or recognizing that climate change is a reality. And I don't think he would turn that down. I think he would understand, and we can even just talk about extreme weather events. Forget climate change. We're going to have more extreme weather. There's the data. So we need more jobs that are that are dedicated to mitigation and adaptation of those emissions and get us prepared for the future.
Well, actually, Alex Ruff, in that conversation we had with him, Barry, he committed that he would work with climate action teams in Grey Bruce. So we can take him by his words and we can think about how we do this in the best way. He's all we got in terms of an MP.
I'll ask the panel, where does the status quo lead us in our region if there's no leadership from government or corporations?
I think the status quo will lead us right down the wrong path. We can't afford to let the status quo continue. The international agencies that are looking at climate change on the global scale are pretty clear about what needs to be done. We need to stop producing oil and gas, and we need to start producing green jobs. I think the panelists who have spoken about the need for good jobs have correctly twinned the two crises. We have an inequality crisis in this country. So that's something that Joyce Hall had kind of highlighted through the housing issue. But we have to do both at the same time. They're not unlinked, and it's possible to do both at the same time. But clearly, the status quo is not going to be sustainable.
This entire area is set up as a service area, and the people who live here, unless they are at Douglas Point or Bruce Nuclear, or from the cities coming up here building big homes and stuff like that, the local people become their servants. And they serve them in the restaurants, they serve them in the stores, they serve them all over the place, but they do become their servants as the status quo.
I think you're right, actually. Inequality is up here as well. We know that this area has lost a lot of manufacturing jobs and union jobs that went with those manufacturing jobs. The whole economy has switched from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, and that has cost people a great deal in this area.
Can I ask the question a bit differently, and I'll ask the other three panelists, what are the barriers to just transition?
I can speak personally living where I do. We got to talk about internet. It's one of the great, the digital divide is this term that came out of the pandemic. I was working from home, my kids were at school, and we were using cellular data where we are. So there's no incentive for companies to build the infrastructure for internet because it costs a lot of money and it doesn't pay off. I live in a hamlet, so they're not going to run, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fiber optic cable for 10 people. It's just not going to happen. So government has to step in and fill that gap. And it's a worthy investment because wherever you have, it's it's physical infrastructure, but it's actually virtual infrastructure is the future. So where roads in the past would have brought prosperity to areas, now it's internet access. So I think there's rurally, it's a youth retention strategy, first of all, combined with a robust public transit strategy to keep young people in the area. And also to have the resources for internet is a huge economic resource. It's an untapped resource because I know my wife is a yoga instructor, and pandemic, those things got shut down. But because we had internet, we paid $3,000 to put a tower up. We put our own infrastructure in. We were able to get more reliable internet, and she was able to work from home and bring in more income. So there's money there. Where the internet goes, money goes. So investing rurally in internet is an investment, just like roads or electricity would have been, a century ago.
I'll jump in, I guess, and Nick's totally right. I mean, and there's been a lot of work done on, trying to ensure that we all have internet access throughout the rural areas and that sort of thing. It's kind of it reminds me a little bit of the natural gas movement in this area, where we're continuing to put lines down new roads, and that seems to be, at least in part, our future of fuel supply. So the other thing that I wanted to mention And I don't know if it's a barrier, but it's more like an opportunity. You know, a lot of people value this area as a place to live, but also as a place to visit. And we've seen, especially up the Bruce Peninsula, but along the shorelines, and a huge influx, probably somewhat related to COVID, but even pre-COVID, to our area. And I think the opportunities in sustainable tourism, in other words, making sure that people understand the range of opportunities in this area. Yes, a place to live, and if you have a good internet connection, that's one thing. But I think part of our economy and part of our new and continued sustainable job future is by doing better managing the resources that we have. And the biggest resource from many perspectives is the natural environment that we continue to appreciate in this area. So
yeah, technology often follows belief systems. And Victoria mentions here that barriers are racism and also probably individual rights beliefs, which also comes maybe with some of what you just said, Barry. I mean, many people now move into this area because they think it's a beautiful area. They can have their little kingdom here and protect it, but don't think about the larger societal and environmental impacts of the living standards, and also which also has to do with transportation and so on. So I mean, racism is a big one up here, which also goes together with our barriers between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, I don't have anything really brilliant to add here, but it's just, to me, it seems to be inertia. When I was listening to those mayors from around the country and around the world, and the things that they had done in, say, you know, Yellowknife and Squamish, I thought, wow, I mean, they're taking the bull by the horns, you know, like getting rid of single family zoning, like, wow, you know, I didn't think that was even possible. So I think sometimes just inertia, just to say we're used to, this is how we create housing. We need houses. We call the developers, you know, I mean, finding new ways to do things, and to looking elsewhere for models and being ready to innovate. You know, that's what I would say, you know, the inertia is the barrier, and the answer to inertia is to innovate and decide, you know, determine what you want, and then, you know, then get the developers to build it.
Yeah, I'll jump on that, Joyce, and say inertia is huge here, and one of the ways to overcome inertia is through political will. And I think I've run up against this even with town council, looking to a simple thing like lower the speed limit. They run up against such resistance because we're so car centric. People want to be able to drive as fast as they can wherever they need to go. And so just a simple thing like trying to lower the speed limit by 10 kilometers an hour to increase safety in communities and allow for active transport to become more feasible. There's resistance because, and I actually heard a town councillor say this, well, we have to think about getting reelected. So political will is I'm speaking as someone who's not elected, but so, you know, I'm yelling from the cheap seats here, but you're elected to do a job. You're not elected to be reelected. I mean, eventually you have to come up with that sort of political will to get things done, rather than just listen to every person who gripes to you. And I don't want to discourage anyone from griping to their politicians, because I know we just talked about that. So please continue doing that. But
Jenny Carver is in our meeting, and she's I can't help but point her out because she's taken the bull by the horns, and we don't like to discourage that by any means. I'm going to put, she's suggesting everyone here get in touch, and she's got some coordinating going on, which I love. So I'm going to put my email, it's in the chat, it's act at climateaction.team. And if you email that address, that's act at climateaction.team. We can get group action going on this for our 3 MPs in our region. And Jenny has also sent, is amazing. She's also sent a little summary here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it. And if you can see here, I'll just run through. Maybe Jenny, you can unmute, and in 2 minutes or less, you can go back to the concept of our MPs, this federal action. If you want to unmute, you can.
Yeah, so there's quite an interesting national wave going on right now around the Green Deal and just transition that we can become part of and get a lot of support to move forward in developing. Number one, signing off on the letter to Trudeau is a priority. Number two, writing a letter to Trudeau specifically around moving on just transition. But number three, which I think would be something for this group to consider, would be for us to coordinate to think about how best to get the ear of and to influence Alex Ruff and other MPs locally to actually take a petition forward. So there's a whole strategy around that, how you get the right people at the table that he actually cares about, because I don't think he cares about me, but he probably cares about some others here, and he probably cares about the guy that's starting the green hydrogen business in Owen Sound, and employers who might be interested in moving forward with some of these things. So I think there's a really good opportunity for us as a community and a number of communities to actually have some impact here at the federal level that I think is worth doing. And, we talk about inertia, we talk about how do we move beyond just our own kitchens and doing what we can here. And this is a chance to actually influence the federal government to move now. There's a lot of resources and support, and there's kind of a wave that we can be part of. So Lee, if people were interested in being part of a group to think through how to do the petition and get the right folks signing it and a meeting set up, is that something we could communicate to you at your at Climate Action? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, yeah, for the 26 people here, just email me if you're interested in signing on or doing something, and I'll take it from there. It's act@climateaction.team. Send me an email, and I'll get you in touch with Jenny and everybody else at GBCAN.
Thanks.
Thinking back to locally, there was a question way back at the very beginning, and forgive me, welcome. I'm just going to say it. Does any of our speakers want to conclude with anything, or start concluding with anything that they've heard of in any local strategic planning that mandates a stewardship of the land for future generations? So Jeanette, way back at the beginning, just wondered if there was any local examples of local strategic plans, and any of the four panelists, would any of you know?
Yeah, I've been following that through the work of a local climate action team, and it's frustrating. Well, they do hear everything, and I can speak from the Collingwood perspective. Unlike Owen Sound, we lobbied pretty hard for them to get a climate action specialist on town staff, and last I heard, it's been a long process. They agreed to do it. They managed to actually propose it, and they posted the position. I don't know if it's been filled yet, but it's actually going to happen. And I actually spoke to council about this, and I advocated for it because I know they want to engage, and Barry, you spoke to this as well, FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Partners for Climate Protection Program. Collingwood's looking to get back into that. They've already done it once and then let it slide, so you have to start all over again. Yeah, so they're looking to get back into that, and they've hired a climate specialist, and there's a green municipal fund through that organization, and there's access to funding. So getting a climate strategist on town staff is actually, I view, as an investment. It's you get someone on staff, and they'll be able to procure funding through that fund. There's lots of it, and because it's going to be a priority for at least probably the next 2 years, the federal government, the taps should be open on that money. So. And there are a lot of plans in place. So, municipalities are thinking about carbon emissions reductions a lot, but there's a long way to go. And I think having a climate specialist on staff is a very good thing. So that's something that happened in Collingwood.
And Town of Blue Mountains is in the midst of developing their integrated community sustainability plan, which is an older name for a climate action plan because it does include mitigation and adaptation strategies. So they're quite active. Jeff Fletcher there is the waste management coordinator. He's the lead on that program, but they've also hired a full-time sustainability coordinator. And I was going to mention, the importance of youth being involved or younger employees and that sort of thing being involved with this, for me, is a real critical piece. And the nice thing, I've just finished, we're doing a bit of work at Town of Blue Mountains, and they've got a guy that's moved up from Waterloo who did a year of climate specialist down there, and he's working with the Town of Blue Mountains. And I think if we can somehow share, in that case, it's the Grey County side of the line, and they are quite willing and will be sharing what they're doing as a lower tier municipality as part of the creation of the county level climate action plan. So I think now Collingwood's in the next county, but there are other municipalities within the Grey County side of things that are moving in this direction as well. So I think the more we can help, as at least I'm speaking for myself, as a non-governmental community group, the more that we can provide not challenging but collaborative information to these municipal leaders, the more I think we'll have the opportunity to have them start to take the lead on these things.
I'm just looking to our response, the GB Can's response to the CCAP. And if you want to look at the Grey County Climate Action Plan, and as I was mentioning, there's 3 days of consultation coming up. If you look at 8.3.4 in that plan, it's called Municipal Culture. And strategy number 13 says retain or appoint a climate coordinator. And our emissions, 44% of our emissions come from agriculture in Grey County. Yeah, I was really shocked. Regarding the climate coordinator that the county is going to retain or appoint, we're going to make the suggestion that that job should be assumed by a highly qualified individual with a specialty in agriculture and climate change. So that's a position that's coming up. And then later on in the section called monitoring and review, they're going to set up a working group, an implementation working group, and GB Can is going to recommend that working group reach out to experts around the community. And we particularly talk about groups such as OMAFRA, ALICE, the conservation authorities, NFU, OFA, and us, like Grey Goose Climate Action Network. In other words, that they go beyond their staff and like really get the expertise, because Grey County is a huge agricultural, green, thin population county. This is where we can make our difference, and this is where our missions come from too. So in your response to the CCAT, you can mention this. Make sure that you get the expertise on board as you move ahead on your climate action plan. Get the expertise where you need it.
Thank you, Joyce. Joachim mentioned briefly that our next climate forum is November 18th. It's called Reduce, the first R. We'll hopefully be talking about tiny homes, retrofits. We'll talk a little bit about the onus on government to be acting on climate. We'll be talking about rural challenges a bit more as well in that, and equity and inequality as well. But did you have anything? And that's November 18th.
Yeah, so November 18th about reduce. So it's also about how we kind of disconnect ourselves, if possible, from consumerism and capitalism, which was brought up today in some of the discussion points. Yeah, so if the panelists have some closing words, that would be great.
About the county climate action plan, I think it's fabulous that the county is doing this, but I think if you drill into these plans and the relationship between what I'll call the upper tier or county level municipalities and the lower tier, I think it is meant to be hierarchical, but so the municipalities like Owen Sound or Town of Blue Mountains or Grey Highlands, those are the lower tiers. And the reality is that the county plans do not address anything but what the county owns. So community farms and anything but even local water treatment and wastewater treatment centers that are run by lower tier municipalities, garbage collection, landfill sites, those kinds of topics are the responsibility of the lower tier municipalities. So the county's plan looks at their corporate ownership. So they what do they own? They own a good number of buildings. They own roads. That's a big part. But are they looking at traffic, or are they looking at the quality of the road? So I think that was just a point that I wanted to add to the table. But just because an upper level government is doing a climate action plan, it doesn't mean that it's doing everything that is the responsibility and owned by the lower tier municipalities. And so I totally appreciate being part of the event tonight, and I've been a part of many of the Zoom calls that have been going on for the last year and a half, and I appreciate everybody's willingness to come out. And I do look forward to getting back on the ground and being able to connect socially with people. And I certainly know lots of people on the calls, but I do look forward to the opportunity to connect with many of you in person, hopefully within the next little while. So thanks again for the organizers. And I think we touched on some great topics, many of which could just be talked about and acted on for many years. So thanks again.
Okay, Barry, thanks. Joyce.
Yes, I really appreciate Barry's comment about the 2 tiers. And I wondered that often as I was working on the county climate action plan. I was thinking, well, who has the money here? I think it's the lower tier that collects the taxes, right? At the same time, the county climate action plan does address both corporate, which Barry was mentioning, what they own, their own assets, and community. And so the climate action plan talks certainly as if they have the authority to, for example, implement a strategy, or at least encourage a strategy like the one I mentioned, compact mixed use development in designated settlement areas, intensification, et cetera. So that's a really good question. I really need to learn more about how the 2 levels interact. But certainly we hope that the good ideas that are in the CCAT can be through moral authority or whatever, passed on to the lower tier municipalities to implement. But Barry's point is really well taken. The implementation really happens at the lower tiers. Yeah, thanks. So that's my comment. Don't have anything else. Thanks.
Good context. David?
I'm not very familiar with some of the things that municipalities are doing, and I'm glad to hear that they're doing what they can. But I am a little more familiar with what's going on up here at Saugeen Ojibwe Nations. Nawash, for example, is very careful actually about its land use. There's a whole area here called an Alvar, Eastern Prairie, which is very rare now in Southern Ontario because they've all been plowed over or built on. But no one is allowed to build on it. So it's being left as it is, as it has been for years and years and years. I'm glad, as I say, I'm glad to hear that the municipalities are addressing this. I wish, however, that municipal councillors would take a look at Section 3 of the Municipal Act. I think they would find there and be very surprised at the amount of authority and power that they actually have. They have the ability to pass bylaws in defense of the environment, bylaws in defense of the well-being of their citizens. For example, there are municipalities in Canada that have actually raised the minimum wage to a living wage for their own workers, and not only for their own workers, but for contractors who want contracts with the municipality. I think you have more authority than you think, and I think you should use it. Anyway, thanks very much for inviting me. This kind of conversation is terrific, and I hope that it leads to some to a bit of a groundswell that our local MP and MPP can't ignore.
With Jenny's help, it will. And it is good to figure out where all this fits. Like I had a ton of questions about who has the onus for this, and it sounds like the short answer is everybody does.
Yes.
Nick, bring us home.
Yeah, it's a really great panel. Barry, Joyce, David, amazing things to say, and I couldn't agree more. David, the conversation is. I love having these kinds of conversations. I think the biggest takeaway for me, I'd like everybody is, political engagement. I'm a big believer in political solutions, especially we've alluded to before carbon footprints being about individuals and trying to sort of separate us and stop us from like really thinking and acting together. So that top down has to happen just like the bottom up. So we're talking about tiers of municipalities. We're talking about individual action, bottom up, top down. It all has to happen. And the dizzying amount of intersectionality there is, we're talking about affordable housing and how it relates to the climate crisis, and they are related. So I really view what's happening right now. We're coming out of a pandemic. We have, I think, I don't think there's been a greater opportunity now than there has been since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We really have to transition our entire way of living. So I don't think anything is off the table. So this is our chance to really address everything, like all of the problems that have been laid bare basically by the pandemic and the climate crisis at the same time. So yeah, let's do it.
Thanks, everybody. It was really great to meet you. And as David said, maybe we can create a groundswell over time by doing this. It's small steps and we don't always know where they go. But anyway, yeah, let's do it, says Barry. So let's do it. And thanks, everybody. And we'll see you hopefully on November the 18th about reduce. Have a good night and safe travels. Bye-bye.
Yeah, Nick,
Thank you.
Nick said, let's do it. I just printed it.
Thanks.
Nick.